Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com, and you can also access all of our podcast information at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Philip Lenczycki, Senior Investigative Reporter for the Daily Caller News Foundation, where he covers China's influence operations in the United States, is a former professor of Mandarin and East Asian civilizations. Philip also has the great distinction of being our number one guest here at the China Desk Podcast. And so 50 plus episodes later, Philip, welcome back to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thanks so much for having me. And I'm honored to be back. And that was a great intro.
Well, Philip, we've always tried to give a little bit of flavor for who we're talking to the audience. And since you went first, people might not remember all the awesome things you did before you decided to be an investigative journalist at the Daily Caller. But let's go back to, say, when you were third grade and they were saying, what did you want to do when you grew up? Do you say, I want to be a reporter?
I can't imagine that's what I said. No, I think at that time, I probably wanted to be, an astronaut or something. But
what went wrong?
No, that was not what I wanted to be. It wasn't on my radar. And it didn't become a part of my life for many years after third grade until I had the chance to start traveling to China. Even at that age, when I was maybe about 13, 14, when I went for the first time, I didn't think that was going to be my calling. But over the years, returning again and again to visit the country, it became something that was, a part of me, an interest that I had. And bit by bit, that became something that I thought would be something that I could sort of get a hold of and then contribute, used to contribute. So that's how it's sort of become a part of my backstory. The nuts and bolts, I lived overseas in China for a little over 5 years and traveled there for some 20 years before COVID made that something that was no longer possible. And then the journalism career, criticizing the CCP, has made it something that sort of put the nail in the coffin. I won't be going back.
Well, there's significant company in that category, but also sort of similar pattern in terms of, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but when you first went to China, what were some of your thoughts and expectations about what you were going to experience? And over the arc of that, say up to the COVID pause, what do you think changed?
Well, I had been traveling in Europe for some years. And so that was my background for travel before I went to China. And I had really no idea. China wasn't on my radar at all the first time I went. And it was a very different place at that time. I remember in 2000, 2001, the first time I went, in Beijing, there were outdoor latrines that were nothing more than really just sort of like troughs dug into the ground behind a fence. And that was in downtown Beijing. And of course, things have changed, remarkably over the years. And my sense was, unfortunately, as I believe I mentioned in the first episode, that in the beginning, I fell for the propaganda, and I was ignorant at that time to what all was going on. And I wanted to believe, I suppose, that there could be better relations. And when I began to live in China some years later, in 2007, at that time, they were gearing up for the Olympics. And so there was a full-on, full-force, campaign with the songs and just everything. There was a whole, buzz to it. But bit by bit, and especially after staying in the country longer and learning the language, and then with the rise of Xi Jinping, things changed a lot. And I should say the scales fell from my eyes bit by bit.
Yeah, well, that is a common journey. I think that a lot of us go through periods of looking at Chinese civilization, culture, language studies, have a degree of romanticism about it. And then we sort of learn that the Communist Party is different from Chinese culture and civilization. And as you say, the scales fall away and you get mugged by reality. And so now you've kind of made a name for yourself in this field for helping mug other people with reality. But it's been interesting to me to watch in the sense that for a lot of my career, people have been trying to help people understand the reality of People's Republic of China, Communist Party rule in China. You have been working very hard to educate people on what they're doing right here in the US of A. And so maybe share a little bit about what that journey has been. You came to the Daily Caller News Foundation. Where did you pick up and how has it gone?
To sort of continue from the last section, I feel to some extent that my work is some type of, penance. I feel badly for not seeing these things before. So in a way, I hope to sort of right some wrongs. But I came to the Daily Caller after working in academia and business in China. And then I had always been interested in journalism, and one day decided that that should be something I should try just full on. So
What
they
year did you
took
start
me
at the
under
Daily?
their wing. The I'm bad with dates about my own life. I would say, gosh, it was right after COVID or so, I think. So around like 2020, 2021, something like that.
Yeah. So it's been a few years. You hit the ground running. I remember relatively early on in that adventure, comparing notes. What were some of the early targets and topics that you launched on?
The first thing I was writing about, actually, before I began with Daily Caller, I was doing some freelance work, and some of the stories I was doing then for Epic Times and things like that had to do with Charles Lieber, actually. And so the Thousand Talents plan that was kind of percolating at that time. I think that must have been, I want to say that was maybe December 2020. Does that sound about right? When he was
Yeah.
being sentenced. I think sometime around then. But anyhow, so the issues regarding what was going on with the CCP here on our soil, how they were influencing and coercing, that was beginning to become more and more, evident. And so those are some of the first things that I was looking into at that time. I'd written about China while I lived in China, but I was really writing about my experience there as a student of language and of the country generally. The party itself was not really a topic. I wrote one story I remember during that time that was about, it's kind of interesting actually. It was about a rumor where I was living in Jinhongdao that there had been a murder at a local college. And everyone was convinced that this, I believe, young girl had been killed, but there was no reporting on it in the news generally. And so that was kind of the closest we got to that I got to writing about sort of the censorship and what all we were being kept from. But anyhow, so in the beginning with the Daily Caller, I did some stories. The first story I ever did there was actually with a Canadian Falun Gong director who had a new movie that was coming out, and I got access to the movie and got to speak with him for some time, and it was really remarkable. That movie was very moving to me. It was showing how the practitioners were swept up in those early days of the repression and what they endured, and that was very maybe set the tone potentially. And thereafter, I was looking into the Uyghur genocide, and I also did a piece early on about Stephen Schwartzman, and his ties to the CCP and their influence operatives here.
Well, that leads into, I think, the first big basket that I think of when I think of your reporting, and increasingly some other colleagues and maybe even competitors in the field, and that's looking at how the CCP has cozied up with political figures. We've had things over the decades that have looked at federal officials. We've had some recent ones that are fun to joke about, but they're not really that much of a joke. But I think over the last few years and the work you've done and others have done, there's been a lot of focus and exposure on what's being done at the city and state level too. And so again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think some things happening up in New York had a particular center of gravity in this genre, I would say. But maybe share with the audience, kind of how you got into looking into these things and what maybe some of the techniques and raw materials have been in trying to pull the truth out from behind the veil, so to speak.
It's a great question. Something that I myself am not sure how I fell into it now looking back. Trying to think who the first individual would have been besides Stephen Schwartzman after that we focused on that was actually a politician. But anyways, it probably got ramped up when we started looking into Representative Judy Chu. And we did a number of articles looking into her ties with various local California organizations to which she was an honorary member or regular member, I believe, at some point or another. Some of these, in fact, were even designated by the U.S. government as being United Front groups, specifically for the unification of China and Taiwan. But anyhow, after that, we did some stories looking at this individual, Dominic Ng. So he was a Biden appointee to APEC. We did a number of articles on that, and those pieces together came out and made something of a splash, I think. Representative Lance Gooden from Texas and I were doing an interview on Fox, and he sort of stirred up the hornet's nest a bit by stating that Representative Judy Chu should be investigated and things of that nature. But these days, now we've looked all across the country, and a number of articles have been looking at Representative Grace Meng in New York, and both her ties to the Chinese police station there in New York, as well as to recently indicted her former congressional campaign director, Linda Sun, who also worked for Governor Kathy Hochul and Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah, well, and then I guess to sort of continue down this arc, you and your colleagues in the field also started noticing some interesting interactions between a party nominee's running mate and some long-time back and forth trips. Maybe share a little bit about what that told us about how some of these influence operations work. You've kind of got the comparison of affinity organizations operating within the United States. Then you've got the United Front groups that sort of invite people to come and go and then sustain that coming and going with probably some expectations. But what was your takeaway from these pieces and the observation of the behavior?
The interesting thing, as I keep going, is that they're all connected. That's what's really interesting. And over time, I think it will become more and more clear what the exact structure is. And simply put, these affinity groups, these hometown associations and whatnot, they're reporting in. They're beholden to the consulates. And so there is a structure in place. These individuals have, some of them, specific roles that they're playing, that they've been hired to do for the consulates, and on top of other feathers in their caps where they might hold positions with United Front organizations back in their province in China and whatnot. So there's a lot of different layers to it. But when it came to our recent investigations into Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, what was really interesting about this investigation was not only did it tie back in to a series we did on these so-called overseas Chinese service centers, of which there are 7 in the United States that are run by the CCP's United Front Work Department. That was interesting to see how he has a history with the St. Paul branch of this overseas Chinese service center. But from a technical standpoint, this investigation was unique for me in that it was very difficult because so much of it was based in China, something that happened also a long time ago. And thirdly, it's in a very unique part of China, at least, by my lights. And what I mean by that is in, Guangdong province and in Hong Kong, you've got an interesting mix of language and history. So for instance, at points where they were in Macau, it wasn't under Chinese control then, it was under Portuguese control. Different things like that made the investigation provide new challenges for me. And actually some of the biggest revelations we found were open source and had nothing to do with Chinese language. It just had to do with digging through old newspapers from, of all places, Alliance, Nebraska. And I really don't know why they hadn't been discovered by other outlets by the time that I happened upon them.
Well, if you're not motivated to look, you're not going to find. But it is impressive that those archives remained. For people who are too young to know, we didn't always have an internet as a permanent archive. There were other means of storing information and data before. And if you go back before everything got put on the web, sometimes it's a little tricky to find stuff. But that's cool that it was those resources that were able to kind of pull up real time the way things were covered then. For people who aren't familiar, let's do 2 things. First, maybe talk a little bit about the reaction, rebuttals you have run into. I assume people who've had pieces run about them have opinions about these things and maybe try to throw some shade back your way. What's been kind of the reaction or splatter back from some of these things? And so what are some of the excuses they give about why this is no big deal?
Last time we spoke, you asked a similar question, and I said, don't give them any ideas, Steve. And unfortunately, you might have given them some ideas. And so it was not long thereafter that we received our first cease and desist. And that was from an individual who's a member of the Committee of 100, who's connected with Dominic Ng, who I mentioned just a bit before. And so at that time, we received a letter from his attorney stating that, we were off base. And the LA Times wrote a hit piece against us. And we, I suppose to the credit of our legal team and, publisher and whatnot, they did not bend. They certainly wanted me to double and triple check everything that we'd found, but we just doubled down and we showed more photos of this individual red-handed. So that was that. In general, the claims that are used, I actually documented once upon a time in a tweet thread, which, how do you know you're dealing with the United Front? There's a number of different indicators, but one of those points was that they use certain language to dismiss these type of concerns. And that ranges from, of course, calling things racist, xenophobic. They state that you're somehow, resurrecting McCarthyism, that you've got some type of quote unquote Cold War mentality, a zero-sum mentality, on and on and on. And so those are usually the charges that are leveled. But there has never been an actual refutation of any of the facts that we've mustered. That is always sidestepped, and it is an attack on our motivation or the repercussions, that there could be some type of quote unquote chilling effect. These type of things are raised.
Well, I think that's an outstanding thread that perhaps we should re-up. It's one of my favorite things to remind people that there are these verbal patterns, these ideological jabs that are just recycled, rinse, repeat, thrown back out. And you're quite right. It deliberately obfuscates any inquiry into the actual matters raised. And so somehow, whether your motives are good, bad, or indifferent, the fact pattern is not to be looked at. But I think it would be fun to circulate that one again. But I guess the other part of this is basically, what is an affinity organization? And you talk these funny words about a united front. But aren't these just groups that are trying to look at fellow ethnic Chinese people together and making everyone healthy and happy in America?
It is not. No, that is not what it appears to be going on, Steve. What it looks to be is that these organizations are working, hand in glove with the consulates, that they actually hold some type of official position with them, and that furthermore, these organizations many times also are some type of branches of chambers of commerce from back in China, apparently related to the All China Federation of Industry and Commerce and things of that nature. So there's a lot of different elements at play, and the leadership may have their own specific, flavor that they bring to it regarding, or coming from the organizations to which they belong. So there are a lot of different, competing forces, but it's very clear when we, have a studied look at these groups that they are, working for and under the consulates. We can see that in a number of different ways. One way is that every few years, when these organizations will change their leadership, at these events, the members of the consulate will come, as will sometimes local representatives that are potentially wise to what's going on. And they'll all play their own role. And specifically, there are moments that we now have many, many, many documented instances of where they will literally, hand over some type of seal. And the sort of exchange will go from the old leader, they'll hand over this physical object, a seal, under the watchful eye of the consulate staff. It will usually change hands through an individual like Representative Grace Meng from New York or Representative Judy Chu from California, and then they will then hand it over to the new leaders. Why that would occur with all those players there, if they were not tied in with the consuls, I cannot imagine myself.
Well, I think I recall from one of the videos that you guys had uncovered, I don't remember which storyline it was, but I think it was in New York. You even had, either by video or in person, visitors from China itself coming in to kind of give their imprimatur to whatever the leadership change was, or the award being given by this affinity group to a U.S. elected official, sort of thanking them for advancing the interests of exactly who?
Representative Grace Meng, I believe that our work this year looking into her ties and her organization's ties to the Chinese government is unique and is very valuable. And what we found, in short, is that she's a member of this organization called the Hunan Association of Eastern America, and that we know through the recent indictments of Linda Sun that this organization had been playing a role in its leadership in bringing Linda Sun officially over to working for the Chinese government, but also that they were arranging or making requests on the New York government to do certain things to allow Chinese officials to come get visas to come to the United States. And through our investigations, what we found was that Representative Grace Meng, going as far back as 2008, she had been receiving and playing a role in sort of, welcoming these high-level Chinese government officials and even, Chinese intel chiefs. We found one instance that we had found video for of the head of the All China Federation of Returned Overseas Chinese, which the Department of Justice calls an agency of the United Front Work Department. And Grace Meng was there. She spoke. She referred to this head as our chairman. She thanked him for his leadership. And the the closest analogous that we have of what is on video there, should someone study it, and I don't say this lightly, it looks a lot like, Godfather, the meeting of, the heads of the families sitting around the table. If you go around the circle of the table, the head table that she was sitting at, and you see who's sitting there, you'll find each and every one of those individuals basically has, a high level position in the United Front organization or several.
Well, and this was not just for burps and tickles going around to have a good evening of food and drink and song and dance, culturally appropriate events, I would say. This actually was a part of an effort that influenced policy. Now, some people may have heard of the fake police station and how these kinds of groups and the cover they provide have resulted in surveillance and harassment of dissidents. And that's, of course, offensive, repugnant. It shouldn't happen on American soil. Our system of rule of law and fundamental freedoms should guard against things like that. But it's worse. This also censored what people were talking about with regard to policy. You're not getting any free Tibet debate, no support for Taiwan debate, no how about we treat the Falun Gong humanely discussion. It's all very much keeping the bowling alley bumpers up on the lane so that you're only engaging in allowed speech and allowed policy. And that also wasn't limited just to those events. From the Sun indictment, it made clear this led to direct influence of very senior elected American officials about what they would say, who they would receive, and what events they would participate in. Talk a little bit about some of the color that was uncovered in this, because I found that story to be extraordinary in that it covered it in great breadth. But it is not an isolated story. It's just isolated. And this was one of the first big stories where almost all the angles were uncovered.
Agreed. And so, to your point, it was alleged in that indictment that they were seeking to keep Governor Kathy Hochul's office from meeting with the Taiwanese officials. And what's interesting to me, looking at that, is as you mentioned, you're seeing all these different elements in play in one document, potentially for the first time, at least that I've seen, and something that hasn't gotten enough analysis. I think that's an element of this that we need to do some work on, is looking at the way that the money works. And at least it's alleged in this indictment that the way the kickbacks work were that the Chinese government operatives, who are the leaders of, one of them is a leader of this Henan Association of Eastern America. Apparently they were setting it up so that Linda Sun's husband, Chris Hu, he was more or less offered the chance to set up a import-export seafood business that would then have some ties to Henan province, and then he would make his money that way. They'd make their money that way. And we don't learn a lot about the ins and outs of the business. in the documents, but we do see that I believe she's got a Lamborghini and the home's in Hawaii at the end of the day. So must have been selling a lot of lobsters.
Given fantastic advice to the state of New York, no doubt.
Right. And that's an interesting element because it's not that apparently, and I've heard this from folks before, it's not that there are, manila envelopes stuffed with cash anymore. They have gotten, to the point where they can just assure that certain things will happen that will be fortuitous for you in China should you care to invest or whatnot, and they can make the money that way.
Well, I want to shift gears just a little bit to another area of inquiry that we've talked about, and there has been blips of reporting on, and it was, a very, very high profile issue in American politics and security, and that's our border. And we've, our border to the south, but we also have one to the north, has had a lot of focus about the kinds of people that were coming across. The national media that had covered it usually was looking at the downtrodden communities of Latin America seeking to make the trek for a better life. That was the narrative. But the more reporting that was done, we started to see people from many other regions and countries. But one of those groups that stood out were Chinese citizens that were making organized trips up from the Darien Gap area of Panama, Colombia, all the way up through the southern border and into who knows where in America. And they seem to have conspicuous demographics and what have you. And there's a lot that probably can and should be known about that. But can you share a little bit about what the investigative journalism piece has been looking at? Who are these people that don't fit sort of the central casting of who Americans think are coming up across the southern border, and what does it really mean for the United States to have CCP members or People's Liberation Army members or just PRC citizens coming undocumented in uncounted ways into the United States?
First and foremost, we spoke a little bit earlier about individuals, outside of our organization, other reporters who've done a good job. And there are definitely a lot of folk who have been doing the groundwork and have gone down to Panama, who have trekked up. And I very much respect their work for having done that. And so one outlet that I think is really worth keeping tabs on is Muckraker. Some of the guys there went down and traveled, I believe, all the way up. And they were not necessarily the first to, for instance, make the passage through the Darien Gap. But to do that, that takes stones, and it's invaluable. And others, someone like Michael Yan, who was down there as well for a very long time looking into these type of things, made for our job all the easier when we decided to turn our attention in that direction. So, and there's many more. There's also a bunch of folks from think tankery world, Todd Bensman and others who've also made the trek and gone down there. So hat tip to all those fine gentlemen. But what we found was kind of interesting. We actually came across a discarded Chinese illegal immigrant cell phone that an individual in San Diego, about 50 miles east, had found. And after analyzing this phone that he passed on the information to us, we found that this individual who had discarded this phone had apparently gotten his itinerary off of a Telegram channel that we found. And this Telegram channel is a Chinese language channel that has sort of documents that have routes of how to get to the United States. It's got specific border wall crossing points that have been identified, and it also has sort of scripts for how to deal with Border Patrol agents. And what was interesting about this, on top of all of that was that the entire network was purported, the individual running it purports to be a Chinese police officer. When you put these elements together and you see that they have a network that apparently spans, the globe, that there are specific spots, very granular, sophisticated understanding of how to travel between these points. And we look at specific countries and cities and what their, united front operations look like. Something, a picture comes into focus where we sort of see that there is a giant sprawling operation, an underground economy and, network where if you're in, southern Mexico in Tapachula, or you're in Panama City or whatever, there are these organizations there that not only, as apparently we know, are going to be helping you, make the crossing at some level, but additionally, the specter is raised that they could also be involved in other activities that would present a national security threat to the United States. And so when it comes to, for instance, Panama, there's a Panama Canal. And when we look at these other locations, as you very well know, the drug trade, I don't have evidence that these organizations are involved in the drug trade, but that is a concern, certainly.
Well, I think there's two things that jump out that I think we could all safely assume. I guess one of the questions is, how close have we come to leaving assume behind and have some evidence that demonstrates the association? Number one, could these groups be acting in this way with ties to the People's Republic of China without the government of the People's Republic of China knowing about it? So I guess there's the first line of inquiry of, is this accidental-like or on purpose? And if so, what might that purpose be? And I guess the second part of it is, can anyone really make this trek without having collusion with the cartels? And is there evidence to show that there's collaboration there?
Every single person with whom I've spoke has told me that no, it is not possible to make the trek without having to deal with the cartels, and that the entire southern border, that region of Mexico that abuts it, is under cartel control. So even when we were down there actually in Jacamba Hot Springs, and when we were there, the Mexican military had positioned themselves right across at one of these hot crossing points. In fact, one of the crossing points that this Telegram channel had identified as one to go to. But even at that time, when I spoke with folks there locally and Border Patrol, their concern was that there were still crossings, so the Mexican military wasn't doing that good of a job. But also, is this really an arm of the Mexican government that is reporting to the Mexican government, or is this has this been taken over? Very difficult to know. I don't know, but folks have looked into this. I believe that James O'Keefe went down there and was poking into things of this nature as well.
Well, as we look at these kinds of things, I wonder if in your conversations you've come across people who've had the knowledge or background with language to get a sense of what kind of people are coming. Is there any distinctions by way of dialects? For a time, there was discussion about demographics of those that were coming. There was frequently used military-aged males in disproportionate supply. But in your back and forth on this, what kind of color could you share on who's coming and what do we know about that?
When we look at the customs and border protection statistics regarding encounters, they do not provide the sex of those making the crossings. They provide the ages. So, but we know from that it's overwhelmingly individuals who are without family and are in this, military age category. So we can begin there. Now, from my own observation, and I've said this before, that yes, I saw Chinese women, but they were few and far between. The overwhelming majority were Chinese men, and they were, as has been said, military age. Individuals like J.J. Carroll and others have, observed that they have a certain bearing. Many have, certain haircuts. They hold themselves in certain ways. It's difficult not to be concerned that they might have such ties. Now, we know from looking into this, Telegram channel that there were individuals within the channel who stated that they were members of the Chinese Communist Party, that they belonged or did then belong to People's Liberation Army, that they were Chinese police, et cetera, and so on. So take that as you like, but it certainly seems that they might be making that crossing.
Well, it sure does seem like the due out for a new administration taking a fresh look at the border might be enhancing the capability to get a gauge on who exactly is coming. I mean, those who have spent their careers studying things People's Republic of China would know that there are certain regions where particular military or scientific specialties might be practiced. And just from language analysis, you'd be able to tell if people are predominantly coming from one area of China or the other. They have different accents. I mean, if you have different accents in the United States, those are replicated even more times over in China. So these things would be knowable if we had the human capital to be able to put at that challenge. So hopefully someone somewhere in the system will hear this discussion all the way to the end and get this juicy tidbit they can pick up and run with. But Philip, before we get to sort of a closing thought or two that you might have, I do want to note for our audience, unless my memory fails, and occasionally it does, you have received a major award from the Daily Caller News Foundation for your outstanding work in this regard. I was hoping I might be present when that all took place, but logistics conspired against me. But what can you share about? It wasn't a leg lamp from the movies, I assume. It must have been something even better.
Well, that's very kind of you to bring up. I was named Journalist of the Year last year, and the year before had the honor of having one of my stories selected for Story of the Year. So I'm very pleased by that. And in a few weeks, we'll have another chance at all of that. But it's tough. It's tough to make a difference, and you just hope that you can keep getting the attention of lawmakers and your audience, that they care about what you're finding.
Well, I think it's awesome. I think the awards were well deserved. I encourage the audience to take a deep dive into your writings and commentary. And in that spirit, why don't you share where people should go look to track your comments and your work, and share any final thoughts you'd like on today's discussion?
Thanks, Steve. You can find me on Twitter at Lenczycki.Philip, and you can find me at the Daily Caller. You can find me. I'm sure you can find me. It's not probably that hard. My closing thoughts. I really appreciate you. I appreciate what you're doing. Congratulations on 50 some episodes. That's an achievement, and I've really enjoyed all of these conversations. Many come to mind, and I've learned a lot. So keep up, the good work.
Well, much appreciated. Well, I want to invite the audience to follow Philip's work. And if you enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends, consider subscribing, and visit ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you for joining, and a special thank you to Philip Lenczycki for sharing his unique perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.